All right, look at that, man. I can't believe it's October 3rd already. JD, are you in costume or are we waiting for a costume? Do you do costume all month or are you more like
You know,
casual?
my daughter is 8 and she's very into Halloween. About 2 weeks ago, we're sitting on the couch on a Sunday, and out of nowhere, she says, "I think Spirit Halloween is open." And I'm like, "There's no way they could be open because it's like September." And I look on my phone and like she literally pegged it like that was the day they were opening. They opened like an hour before she said that. So like last year, we actually cleared out Spirit Halloween. We bought every animatronic they had left on their closing day at like 80% off. They're all in the garage right now. I know what I'm doing tomorrow.
See, they know who the best salespeople. They're like, you know what? Why don't we get JD Barker's daughter? Let's bing her with a text and tell her that the store open.
Yeah, well, I get certain expectations when people come to my house, so I don't want to let anybody down.
Well, is that the pressure of being a thriller writer? Is like, you kind of fell into being a lover of Halloween because you had to because of the expectations.
No, I mean, I think I always liked it. I mean, now I do it for my daughter more than anything.
Yeah.
But it's always been my favorite holiday. I mean, years back, I mean, to really kind of date myself, when I was growing up, we grew up without a TV in the house, and this was
Mm.
like the '70s, so there was only 3 channels. There's nothing worth watching anyway. But I basically started off reading at a very early age. But the first book that actually really hit home for me was Dracula. Prior to that, I had read like all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews and a couple of the classics like Charles Dickens and Mark Twain and stuff. I picked up a copy of Dracula at a yard sale for 25 cents. I didn't think my mom would let me buy it because I was only 8. It looked super scary. It looked like an adult book that I shouldn't have.
Yeah.
I read it and then I left, like the lights in my room, I probably kept on for like 3 weeks after that. It scared the bejesus out of me. And honestly, like I've been chasing that feeling as a reader and as a writer ever since. That's the first time I ever gotten like an emotional reaction out of a book, and I wanted it again and again and again.
Have you found that experience in other books connected to that Dracula moment, or is it just a different feeling?
I discovered Stephen King not long after that, so that filled the void. If you flash forward a little bit, the second book that I actually wrote, I worked on a prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family, so the world kind of came full circle.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I got to write a prequel using Bram's original notes and journals, which was very cool. Today I basically bounced back and forth. I was very conscious at the beginning of my career. I wanted to make sure I didn't get pigeonholed. Because the second you contact your audience, you had mentioned is writers, right? So I can kind of go into the weeds a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The second you contact an agent and they start contacting publishers on your behalf, everybody tries to put you in a box. They want to label you as a horror author, a thriller author, or this author or that author. The agent tells the editor that, the editor tells the marketing people that, the marketing people tell the bookstore people that, and that's how your book ends up on a certain shelf. So if you rock that boat, everybody gets frustrated with you. But at the same time, I studied the careers of some of the biggest name authors that were previously out, and I looked at what they were doing. And most of them were essentially household names, not because of what they were necessarily writing, but because they had built a brand.
Yeah.
So I really started to focus on that. And if you look at somebody like Stephen King, like we walk into a bookstore, we buy one of his books because it's got his name on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really care what it's about. And his name is prominent on that cover. It's very large. The title is usually a lot smaller because they know that is the brand and that's what they use. I studied all of that and looked at, all these different things and made sure I incorporated that from the get-go. So my very first book was a horror novel. Then I wrote a thriller. Then I wrote the prequel to Dracula. So I bounced back to horror. Everybody in my camp hated that, agents, editors, all those people, because they didn't know what to do with me. But ultimately, it was almost like being a literary Pied Piper, so I gathered this horror audience, and then all of a sudden I write a thriller. And if you keep the books semi-adjacent where there's a common thread between them, like in my case, it's suspense. As long as you have that going on, the readers will come from one camp to another. And you basically start picking up, different people, from these different genre camps. I remember one point, probably maybe 5 or so years into it, my editor was on a call with me, and he said, "Hey, we just got your demographics back, and it looks like your primary audience is women 45 and over." So like their first inclination was, okay, let's write stuff to target women 45 and over. My thinking was, how do I get somebody that's not 45 and over and expand that audience? So I wrote a young adult book. I started roping them in their teens and their 20s, and expanded my audience that way. So I'm always looking at ways to, build the entire thing.
Yeah, because you could have easily just wrote an erotic book or a romance book and just went into the 45 and older female audience. But, even going back to the brand comment you were saying, you know, when you co-wrote that book, The Writer with James Patterson, his name is really big, and then your second big, and then the name of the book is there. And some people think, oh, the book's name is the most important. You're like, no, Steven Spielberg makes a movie. It says filmed by Steven Spielberg, Jurassic Park. Like, brand is so important for marketing and draw. More importantly, you know, it's the supply and demand. You know.
Yeah, so I've been writing with Jim now for I guess about 8 or 9 years. Where we just finished up book 6, and he's taught me just as much on the business side as he has on the writing side. You know, I've seen him kind of do the same thing. You know, at one point, you know, right after we had finished up our second book, he told me that he was writing a book with Bill Clinton. And I was like, why would you write a book with Bill Clinton? He's like, because Bill Clinton has this huge audience that nobody has ever tapped before. And, you know, that book came out, hit #1 on the New York Times list. It stayed there for a really long time. There were literally pallets of it, like when you walked into a Walmart. You know, the guy knows what he's doing. And then a couple of years ago, he called me up. He's like, I'm going to write a book with Dolly Parton. You know, he had just gotten off the phone with her, and you know, he did that too. And Dolly Parton is one of the biggest country stars out there. He again roped in this huge audience and expanded his. Just recently, he called me from a warehouse. He had just gotten out of a meeting with a guy named Mr. Beast.
From
Yeah, so he's the #1 YouTube star. You know, he's writing a book with Patterson. You know, and you know, Patterson is going to rope in that younger demographic that, you know, they know this guy from YouTube. They may not read fiction, they may not read James Patterson, but they will. You know, so like I watch that stuff so closely and try to incorporate it. You know, it's so difficult to claw your way ahead in this business. Like anything like that you can get is worth chasing.
Yeah, and you know, James Patterson's obviously one of the forefathers of writing books prolifically. You know, he's got over 200 books in itself. You know, my question though to that, you know, because it is interesting, especially co-writing with anyone. But more importantly, other than the spreaded geographics that you're talking about, what was something you learned from Patterson about the business that made you like have a back, you know, your head slash back, like where you're just like, whoa, like you just didn't. You didn't see that coming, and you were just like, that's interesting.
He honestly does that to me almost every time we talk. You know, if you look back at his career, like he basically started with nothing. He lived in a boarding house when he was a kid. So he had no money whatsoever. His parents didn't have any money. And everything that he's got, he's created. As his last real job, he worked in advertising in New York. He wrote the Toys R Us theme song of all things. But while he was working on that, he was writing books in his spare time. You know, just like everybody else, trying to crank out that novel while he's working that, you know, 80-hour-a-week day job. Yeah. His first book was called The Thomas Berriman Number, which I don't even think he has a copy of. Like nobody bought that book. His second one was Along Came a Spider, and you know, he came out of the gate and did pretty well, but not what he wanted it to do. And at one point, he took a step back and he put his marketing cap on. You know, basically told himself, I've been building brands, helping all these other people succeed, selling all these different types of products. What can I do to sell this book? You know, he didn't look at it as his own book. It's like, how do I sell this book? It's a widget, you know, it's a product. So ultimately he spent $500 of his own money and he created a television spot. And at the time, nobody was using television to push books. And I don't know if you remember it. I think you can Google it. It's probably on YouTube. But it basically just said, your wait for the next Silence of the Lambs is over. There's a voiceover, and a tiny little spider just comes creeping down from the corner of the screen. You know, it's maybe a 15-second spot, really short. But it completely ignited sales on that book. And that's what caused his career to take off. You know, so if he had taken that step back and done something on his own, if he had just relied on his publisher to get it done for him, there's a very good chance he would still be working in advertising today, and none of us would actually know his name.
Yeah, and that's a really great point when it just comes to sales and branding and marketing. And it's something that we talk about often on this channel, to make a right left here, where authors feel I have to write the greatest book and the greatest book will sell. And my argument, my pushback to that is, well, just write the book, finish the book, then put it in the closet and wait for people to knock at the door. Because you need a great book for longevity, but a great book doesn't sell. And James Patterson, as an example, who wrote that book, who became a movie, right? Like all these wonderful things came from it. But it wasn't until he used his marketing brain to connect to something emotionally with the audience that drew some intrigue and interest. Would you stand by that, or do you argue that a great book alone will sell itself?
No, nothing sells itself. I really honestly think every book needs to be a great book. Like
Yes.
if it's going to work, and you need to write a 5-star book. You need to tweak it to the point where it is a 5-star book. If you put out something mediocre, it's going to fizzle and die.
Yeah.
You can take any book and you can put marketing dollars behind it, and you can get people to look at it. You can get them to pick it up. But the second you pull that, the second you stop advertising, it dies.
Yeah.
The only thing that actually sells books, sells products in general, is word of mouth. So
Mhm.
you need somebody to discover your book, probably through an ad. They need to read it, and then they need to go, holy crap, and tell like 5 of their friends about it. And those people need to run out and pick it up. They need to read it, tell 5 of their friends. And it creates this viral thing. And that is what sells books. And it's not something you can manufacture. All you can do is write the perfect book. If you try to do that with anything other than a perfect book, again, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and that's in marketing we call that third party introduction. And what I love about that is ultimately you're getting the emotional truth of somebody who liked the book, and they're telling a friend or family, and they're like, I like this book. And because they have that relationship, they're willing to trust the book. And now they're like, well, my friend liked it. So they're automatically coming in with the bias of, I think I might like this book, because they trust it. And that's sort of like, it creates this viral thing, the hysteria, but on a lower, obviously no town or city is running off causing chaos.
That's what it takes, though, to
Yeah.
make that much noise. I mean, if you think about the number of books that are published on an annual basis, your book is one. What are you going to do to stand out in that crowd? You got to do something different.
Yeah, and that actually, it's something that when it comes to, because you talk about the hybrid publishing, the future of hybrid publishing, and it's also something that Brandon Sanderson talks about, where he's trying to get himself away from traditional publishers and go more into self-publishing. What is it about hybrid publishing that you feel there is a future in, and what interests you in it?
Well, I've hit all of them at this point. So my very first book, I indie published it, but I did it in a way. I basically used a book from Random House as an example, and said my book needs to be just like this. Like I need to follow their schedule. So I hired professionals across the board for the cover, for editing, for formatting, all those types of things. It came out as a hardcover, an audiobook, and an ebook on the same day. Then 6 months later, we released a paperback. So I basically followed that same publication model the big guys were doing, and ultimately I ended up selling a lot of copies. It moved about 250,000 copies of that indie published title. When you do that, you end up on the radar of the traditional guys. So when I was ready for my second one, I had no trouble querying an agent. I had no trouble getting a publisher. The book ended up going to auction, and we got a film and TV show deal out of it that all amounted to roughly 7 figures.
Nice.
So I went from the indie market to the trad guys. And my next couple of books came out through the big trad publishers. Putnam was in there, Random House was in there, HarperCollins was in there. But I had gotten a taste of being an indie. And I kind of wish that never happened, but I'd seen the economics of it. As an indie author, you make about 70 cents on the dollar. On the trad side, you're lucky if you get 15 to 20 cents on the dollar. They give you a nice big check at the beginning, which is awesome, but you've got to pay all that money back, and it's all coming out of your sales. So you've got to move a lot of books. I didn't like giving up the control that I did. Like they can change the title of your book. They have total control over your cover. They'll ask you if you like it, and you can weigh in on it. But if you push back, and the book doesn't sell, then they blame it on the fact that you made them change it. So you're kind of stuck with whatever they give you. But I did a couple of books through the trad world, and I did well with that. It got my name out there and got my books in all those places you would expect, the bookstores, airports, big box stores and stuff. But then I was probably about 4 or 5 books in, and I wanted to do something different. So I called my agent, and I had a book called A Caller's Game that I just finished. I told her I'm going to go ahead and indie publish this through my own press in English. So all the English markets I'm going to handle on my own, and you can go ahead and sell all the foreign territories. And I'm in about 150 different countries. So she did that. I published in English, and I did a couple of books that way. And I really liked it because it gave me the freedom that I needed. I got the economic rewards of publishing as an indie. I was already known, because of the traditionally published books. I didn't have a whole lot of trouble, getting the name out there because people already knew me. So it was a little easier to get into some of the bookstores and stuff. But there were still places I couldn't get to. Airports were near impossible. Things like Costco, Target, Walmart. They don't touch indie books. So I wanted to solve that problem. So I guess about a year and a half ago or so, I had another book done called Behind a Closed Door, and I was getting ready to shop it with my agent. He took it out. We immediately got a film option on it. That actually happened before we got a publishing deal. He was was getting ready to go to the big publishers with it. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine that worked at HarperCollins, and she said, listen, we're about to offer on your book. And when that comes in, you need to turn it down. And I said, why? And she said, well, the editor who wants your book is going to get laid off. We're about to lay off a lot of people, and you just don't want to get caught up in that mix. I got a similar phone call from somebody at Random House. And then a week or two later, all these industry layoffs happened. If you've ever known somebody who had a book that, where you lose your editor, like it can end up in limbo. It may not come out at all. So that's a horrible situation. So I took a step back. I used to work in finance. That was my last day job. I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm. A private equity firm had recently bought Simon & Schuster. So I reached out to some friends of mine that worked in private equity, set up a meeting, and ultimately I struck a deal with Simon & Schuster where I created my own imprint on Simon & Schuster, but they handle my print sales and distribution. And that's what I'm doing today. So I basically have my own publishing house. I can put out what I want when I want, just like an indie author. I have to bankroll it all, but I've got Simon & Schuster as the backbone, getting it into all those places that I couldn't get into before. I honestly see that as being the future of where all of this is going, because, if you take any indie author that's selling really well, big publisher, Random House could walk up to them and say, here's a check for $1 million. We want your next book. That indie author is going to say no, because they know how quickly they can make that money on their own if they put it out, through their normal channels. But, if a publisher comes to them and says, hey, let's do this as a partnership, you can put out the book through us. We'll handle your print sales and distribution. Then all of a sudden it gets interesting, because, the author can make a lot more money. The publisher isn't, putting their own money on the line anymore. So they're willing to take some risks, and they're leveraging the assets that they have, which is essentially the warehouse distribution and those other, their sales platform. It's Simon & Schuster was willing to do it because private equity was forcing them to think outside the box. They were first to the table. But I think over the next couple of years, you're going to see the other big publishers come around to doing the same things, because the existing model is broken. They can't continue to work the way that they are. If you walk into a bookstore, walk into a Barnes and Noble, and look at the titles of the best-selling books, these are all authors that are older. They're honestly they're aging out, and they're not replenishing that stock. The publishers aren't bringing in the debuts. They're not cultivating debuts and turning them into household names anymore, which means when these people do age out, they don't have anything in the coming up the pipeline that's going to be able to replace that. And that's a real big problem that they need to solve right now. Most people are publishing indie because of that's just where the money is at.
Now, you don't think Stephen King's going to live beyond his death?
Somebody like King, they will find manuscripts in hidden drawers and closets and things like that for years and years and years.
Fine.
And I honestly, like I know those books are there. Like King and I have emailed before. We talked about working on a project once together, and like I know he's got a closet in his house filled with manuscripts, boxes and boxes of stuff that he has just dumped in there, over the years. James Patterson, again, he got a phone call, I guess about 2-3 years ago from Michael Crichton's wife. She found a manuscript, and that was a legit story. Like I talked to him about it. She found about 100 some pages in a drawer, with a ton of notes that he had started and he had never finished it. So he ultimately finished up that book. It's called Eruption. Got option for big numbers on the film and TV side. But that kind of thing happens. If you're an author, like I know I've got boxes of stuff that hasn't been published yet. There's tons of things on my hard drive. So yeah, that stock is there.
My computer's filled with soft form outlines and like stuff, just so I can, because when you're writing, what's one of the biggest things authors deal with? They start getting ideas for other stories. So, when I do that, I just write a quick outline and then I go back to working on the book I'm working on,
Honestly, the AI stuff scares me a little bit, because if you look at the history of publishing, they've been doing this for a long time. VC Andrews has been dead since like 1980 something, but she still puts out a couple books a year. Clive Cussler is another one. Like there are so many, they pass away, and like that name just continues to come out with new product. They've got a co-author on it. Some of them are ghostwritten, but they find a way to get it done. I think with AI, sooner or later, they're going to find a way to continue to churn these out. A lot of times the author's family has no say in it. Like the name could be trademarked through the publishing company. It could be a copyright thing where they don't have any control. Like Tom Clancy's estate went through something similar because of that. So like if there's money to be made, a bunch of people are going to sit around in a conference room and find some way to make it happen.
Yeah, but Lee Childs did a really smart thing. You know, his brother's like 14 or 15 years younger than him, and they've been like co-writing the most recent Reachers. And, you know, ultimately his brother is taking it over, and Lee Childs wants to kind of retire, you know, live in his American little ranch or whatever he's talking about. And, you know,
Yeah.
that's smart. You know, that's a benefit to the estate itself. Because like you're saying, once somebody passes away, even Lord of the Rings, you know, Tolkien's estate was being sued. You know, they were fighting for rights and stuff like that, especially as far as back as the Hobbit movies, you know. And so it's always interesting to have people in the family. Like Stephen King has his son. His son's a very well-known author. You know, he writes, he does his own thing. He published under a different name, so he wasn't, you know, so he can make his own mark. You know, so it's always good like that. I mean, obviously, you're saying you have a daughter who likes Halloween. You just got to kind of nudge her into becoming a writer. So when JD Barker calls it a day and retires, we can keep the stories going.
Hand the Mac off to the next generation. You know, you have to be careful of it, because I've seen so many like good things come from that, and I've seen so many bad things. You know, like when I worked on the prequel to Dracula for Bram Stoker's family, I learned that is the second most purchased book in the world behind the Bible. It's that popular of Dracula of a book. The family sees none of that because it's in public domain. And the only reason it's in public domain is because the Stoker family didn't hire an attorney that was capable of navigating those waters. There's ways to keep that copyright, you know, in trusts and corporations. There's different ways, things that could have been done, but they didn't do it, and unfortunately they lost out on that.
Yeah, and that's why we get so many different variations of Dracula and cinema and all these other things, because they have the rights to sort of play with it. It's sort of like the original Mickey Mouse is officially available. People can do the black and white Mickey Mouse, you know, the rap version. When it comes though to to writing and stuff like that, you know, you talk about you know, I've heard you in interviews. I did some research on you when you came out to me, and I really like that you're publicly open about your autism and that you support autism and how it helps you write, and just the idea of writing the Dracula book, you know, to connect it to that. You were saying in these interviews that you sort of can take on the personalities or the ideas of other people, and it helps you write people a little bit clearer. What about that skill, that tool, helped you take the Dracula book and work on a sequel? And more importantly, was it written in a diary format, or did you write it in long form POV?
Epistolary. So what you're getting to, like, I was diagnosed with a form of autism called Asperger's syndrome when I was 22. So prior to that, I was a complete mess. I had no idea what was going on. And I've spent 30 years or so trying to deal with it. And it's, you know, it's got its good points and it's got its bad points. One of the things that I learned very early on, and if you know anybody that's on the spectrum, we tend to mimic other people. You know, so if we're in a social situation and somebody cracks a joke, I'm going to laugh because the people, you know, right around me are laughing, not necessarily because I find it funny. I'm basically mimicking what I see everybody else doing because that's what I feel I should be doing. I can do the same thing on paper, which is something I stumbled into years ago. So if you put some text in front of me written by somebody, I can read that. I can pick up on their vocabulary, their writing style, their cadence, their pacing, and I can continue writing in their voice. So I spent years when I was working in the corporate world, you know, I would come home at night and I would write on these various projects to stay sane. And a lot of them were, you know, working on other people's projects. You know, somebody started a manuscript and didn't get to finish it. I did a ton of memoirs for people, you know, like a female politician, for example. Like I would sit down and interview her, get a bunch of interviews on tape, transcribe it, and then I would have to write a book in first person and from her point of view. And I was able to do it because I had enough of those conversations in front of me. So yeah, that's definitely a skill set that is unique to me. I haven't run into anybody else that has it. I know it's related to the autism side of things. You know, it's just not something that just comes naturally. And plotting a book is another one. You know, like I write computer code too, and like when I write a book, writing, you know, that is very similar to writing a computer program. When I write that first line of text, I need to understand how it's going to impact the last line of text, you know, which is no difference than a computer code. And I see that framework in my head. I know how this is going to impact that, how it's going to impact this, and I see the, you know, that structure, and I'm able to mimic it, which again I know comes from autism.
What helps you kind of find your own voice or maintain the consistency in your author voice when you're able to kind of absorb so many different styles over the years?
That was a very tricky thing for me, because I worked behind the scenes as a book doctor and a ghostwriter for 23 years, basically helping people,
Hmm.
publish their own projects. So that whole time, every book that I worked on was in somebody else's voice. So when I finally did sit down to write one of my own, actually finding my own voice was a very tricky thing to do. I've got a couple manuscripts, like we were just talking, that are on my Mac that were essentially practice books. Me trying
Yeah.
to figure out what my voice was. And I've learned, just in talking to other authors, I think you have to write about 500,000 words, and then all of
Mm.
a sudden it just clicks, like your voice just comes out, and then it becomes the dominant voice in your writing style. I think most people tend to start off writing like the people that they read.
Mm.
If you read a lot of Tom Clancy, you're going to write like, or try to write like Tom Clancy. You're
Yeah.
not going to be as good, but that's what you're going to shoot for. But then eventually you hit a plateau, and all of a sudden your brain says, "Oh, okay, I know what we're doing now," and your own voice kind of creeps out. So yeah, I think everybody's kind of got to go through that, before they can to really get going on their own.
You know, one of the things that I find myself talking with other authors about, and a lot of times when I do my lives, we talk about this or the comments and stuff like that. When it comes to author voice, is what is author voice? So I like to sometimes ask prolific authors themselves, like yourself, JD Barker, and how would you define author voice in a way that would help aspiring authors kind of realize that it might not be as crazy as they think?
In all honesty, it's your own voice. A lot of people, when they sit down to write, they're trying to mimic a style. They're trying to, replicate something. They're not really writing in a way that's similar to themselves. They might try to write literary fiction, but that's not the way they speak. It's not the way they think. So it comes out forced. But sooner or later, like I said, when you write enough, your own voice kind of takes over.
Mm.
I think we all hear it, ChatGPT, I think, is a good example. Like it's being used so often at this point. If I get an email that's written by ChatGPT, I can tell. If you see a paper written by ChatGPT, you can tell, and it's because ChatGPT has its own voice. And we are all getting used to that voice, and we're able to identify it, and it's no different than a person.
Yeah.
Every big name author out there has their own voice. So it's like when you're able to get past what you've read, what you've learned, and find your own voice, that's when it all starts to click and fire on all cylinders.
Now, is that something you consciously do when you're doing like a second or third draft? Are you specifically reading through, focused on, is my voice being clear in this? Or do you, at this point, it's not something you even think about?
At this point, it just comes out. It's sometimes I have to go in the opposite direction though. So like we talked about the prequel to Dracula, I used all of Bram Stoker's notes in journals, diaries, things like that. We put all those things together when we wrote that book. We lifted paragraphs from things that he had written in his journals and put it in there, and then I had to continue it, in his voice. So I made a conscious decision to make sure that I stuck in his voice. And like a funny thing happened when we turned it into our editor. They hired another editor to go through the book, who had a degree in Frankenstein or a doctorate in Frankenstein. There's people out there that do that. But this editor went through and they took out a ton of the stuff that I put in there. They replaced like the word between with the word betwixt. Got rid of every contraction that I used. So it's no longer like every contraction was gone.
Yeah.
And then sent the manuscript back and said, okay, this is now it sounds like it was written way back in the day. And the truth is, like, Dracula was written years before, or Frankenstein was written years before Dracula.
Mm.
When Frankenstein was written, they did use words like betwixt. They didn't use contractions. They
Yeah.
capitalized every proper noun. The rules of writing changed between Mary Shelley's time and Bram Stoker's time.
Yeah.
So when I got that back, I was able to, because I knew Bram's voice, I had seen his writing, I understood how he wrote, so I was able to go through that and handpick everything the editor put in there that didn't make sense, things that Bram wouldn't have said. And we ultimately had to change it back. And like once they put it in front of the right people, people that actually understood Dracula, they realized that I was right. So those things it's always been around from the beginning of the written word.
Yeah, and that is something that authors do struggle with, finding the right editor, because just because they're editors, even if they're advanced editors, doesn't mean they're the right editors for you as the author. They have to understand what the project is about. And that's a great example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a lot of aspiring authors. One of the things I always tell them to do when they're looking for an editor is just take one piece of writing that you've done, and it could be a chapter of your book, it could be a piece of short fiction, whatever, but send it out to a bunch of different editors and get the feedback back from all of them, and then go through it, and then find somebody who actually meshes with your style. Because
Mhm.
it's not easy to do, and I think it's, anybody can say they're an editor. Anybody can throw up a website and say, "Hey, I'm an editor now." They can put up a Readsy profile or whatever.
Yeah.
You really have to put these people through the test and make sure they actually know what they're doing, and make sure that they work well with you.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're gonna, like we're talking about author's voice. It's gonna disappear. It's gonna fade away into the.
It becomes the editor's voice.
Yeah.
And
Um.
if you don't feel that out properly, your editor might be some kid in the Philippines who doesn't even speak English as a first language, and they're using ChatGPT to edit your work,
Yeah.
and sending it off to you. So you've got to be so careful.
Yeah, because it becomes flat. But you were talking about contractions and stuff. I was actually having a conversation with another author around my area of success, and we were talking about the debate between contractions or non-contractions. Since you brought that up, I sort of want to ask you a question about that. Um, would you say contemporary writing is for or against can't or cannot? Like, which one do you think is appropriate in a third person limited manuscript?
I mean, honestly, it depends on the character,
Mm,
and whether it's used in dialogue can be very different from whether it's used in something else. But everything that I write, I try to think of, almost like I'm sitting at a campfire telling this story to somebody sitting across from me.
yeah.
So the same language I would use to tell that story to that person sitting across from me is the same language that I'm going to put on paper. And the grammar checkers, like they will flag tons of this stuff, because it may not necessarily make sense, particularly in dialogue.
Yeah.
But if it comes off and sounds authentic, it works. And
Mhm.
that's what you really want to shoot for. If you start correcting those things, taking away from your own voice just because, Grammarly or whatever told you to, I think that could become problematic.
Now, Grammarly, as we say, is AI, right? And there's that debate
Yeah,
going on right now.
I'm picking on Grammarly, but honestly, they're all the same thing.
Yeah, right. It's like, but I think Grammarly is good, just like an editor, right? It's our job as writers to ask the question: is this adjustment what we want, or can I use this adjustment to make a new adjustment in my voice? And I think authors forget that.
Yeah, I mean, like I've got Grammarly installed on my computer. I write in Scrivener, which I think a lot of authors tend to use. And it flags stuff as I'm going. It does it in real time now, which is nice. But a
Yeah.
lot of times it'll tell me to put a comma someplace where I don't think the comma belongs. Usually, the best check for that is I read it out loud. You put a pause in if there's you've got a comma, you take the pause out, whatever. But you read it out loud and see whether it sounds right. Or you can get Scrivener or Word or whatever program you're using to read it to you, which is another way to check.
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, these things aren't actually able to read what you're writing. They're looking at the grammatical rules that have been programmed into them. Like if you've got three different things you're comparing separated by commas, it's going to throw the word "and" before the very last one automatically,
Yep. Yep.
which may or may not make sense. But you need to look at those. They're all suggestions. So if it makes sense, then by all means accept it. But definitely question it.
Yeah. The Oxford comma has its place.
It does, but it's funny because everybody now is using these same programs, and these same
Yeah.
programs are all using the same databases, the same code as a backbone. It's forcing all writing to kind of sound the same.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the problem with like a Grammarly. But again, as long as you're using it as a guide and you're saying how does this help me look at what I wrote, and is what's there good or not?
Yeah, I think in On Writing, Stephen King said, just make sure you understand all the rules before you start breaking them, and that's all this really is. It's going to follow the rules 100%, but that doesn't mean that it's right.
Yeah, because even in dialogue, sometimes a grammar check or even Google Docs or Scrivener, they're going to say, "Hey, this is improper English," and you're like, "Yeah, but it's also this character doesn't use proper English."
Yeah, no, dialogue is very important when it comes to that. None of us speak like that. Like you have to think about how people speak in real life. That's how your
Yeah.
dialogue should come across. One of the training exercises I used to give people is I would tell them to go to a coffee shop and eavesdrop on the table next to them and type the entire conversation. 'Cause
Yeah.
I feel it's important for a writer to not only hear the words, but see what that conversation looks like on paper. And you're going to find that nobody speaks in complete sentences. There's a lot
Mhm.
of, weird pauses going on. There's distractions happening. All of those things, are important. You don't necessarily have have to put them all down on paper when you're writing a book, but the more you're able to capture that, the more realistic it's going to seem. If you've got three people at a table all talking to each other, they're all going to have distinct vocal patterns. They're all going to have their own, vocabulary, their own cadence, their own way to, method of speaking. You should be able to pick that out and identify it. And it honestly, it works best when you can do it in real life. That's why I bring up the coffee shop. If you have to cheat, you can always throw on Netflix and try and do it that way. But the problem with a TV show is like that, those words are already filtered.
Yeah.
Those are words that were written down. Somebody's acting, they're reading a script. You really need to hear real people talking in real life. And that's where you're gonna, it's really gonna click for you if you're having trouble with dialogue.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying, but I'm going to do a little pushback just for the fun of it. So just so readers don't misinterpret what you're saying, dialogue in narrative also needs to have plot forward. And traditionally, people in a coffee shop are not moving their lives forward when they're talking about Nancy or like Jake the other day, he tripped on him and spilled coffee everywhere. Like where is the writer's brain come in with that? How do they take the more natural sort of random dialogue of human nature and filter it through plot, world building, and character?
Well, it's the patterns that are important, the actual speaking patterns and being able to recognize the differences between different people. If you told a story and then I told that same story to somebody else, you and I are both going to tell the story in different ways. And you as the author, you need to be able to tell it in both ways. In a lot of ways, it's like being schizophrenic. You've got to have multiple voices in your head and you need to be able to put those down on paper. When it comes to moving the story forward, though, that's a whole other animal. It's different. I think even people in a coffee shop, when they're having a conversation, you've got, let's say, two people that haven't seen each other in a week. They're sitting down having a cup of coffee and catching up. They're telling each other stories. They're going to try and do it in a way to make it interesting for the person that they're talking to. There should be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think a lot of people do accomplish, most of those things.
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. Some people tell stories that never end.
There's that too. Yeah, but I mean, the key is just picking up on those different people. I wrote a ton of memoirs when I was younger, and that really helped me with character development because they were all written in first person, from so and so's point of view. And I did sports figures, I did politicians, I did actors, I did actresses. So that really helps me to be able to create, basically characters in my mind that were fully fleshed out. And you need to be able to do that.
Yeah, and this could even go back to I was reading some stuff about you where it's about authors, they must dare to think differently. And I love that kind of thought, that position, and taking what we're talking about from dialogue to branding to like you said, expanding your brand, writing in different genres. What about our conversation today would you say really encapsulates the authors must dare to think differently?
Ooh, I mean, I'll give you an example of one of the things I do. So every time I've got a new book coming out, I take a look at what everybody else is doing to market their books.
Mm-hmm.
And once I figure that out, I try to come up with something that nobody is doing to market their books. So to give you an example, the book behind me, it's called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's a haunted house story. And the house in the story, the one in the picture on the cover, is a real house. I live off an island in New England called Newcastle. My story is based on an even smaller island right off our coast called Wood Island, and the only thing on it is this one particular house. The tagline for the book is, "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So like it's a pretty strong tagline. It's essentially about a kid. He's 17 years old and he inherits this house from his grandmother. She passes away and leaves it to him. So he does exactly what you would expect. He turns it into a party house for him and his friends. And they go out there, they drink, they have fun, basically someplace they can go away from the parents and the police for a little while and just kind of be themselves. But that gets boring after a little while. And then somebody raises their hand and say, "Hey, what would it take to turn this house into a haunted house?" And they start to brainstorm, and they start right where you would expect. There's a couple of scary stories. Somebody brings in a Ouija board, but things escalate. And that tagline for the book: "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So you know where they're going. It's in the back of your mind the whole time. So I've got this book coming out. it's a haunted house story. It's based on a real location.
Mhm.
What can I do to promote it? Ultimately, what I decided on, I created a contest where we drew the name of one person. They were allowed to pick 3 friends, and we let them stay overnight in the haunted house.
Oh, that's cool.
And to get to this haunted house, because it's on a private island, like we basically had to load them up in a boat, take them out to the dock, drop them off, and then pick them up 24 hours later.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like the second I announced that, author giving away overnight stay in haunted house to promote book, like that got eaten up by the press.
Yeah.
So we were running ads and doing all the stuff you're supposed to do, but that created that word of mouth, that buzz that I was talking about earlier that you need to do. If you went on social media, everybody was talking about this. Like, would you do it? I'll do it. I'll do it if you do it. I'm not doing it. But like everybody was chatting about it, and every single person that talked about it sold books. So you can't replicate it. If you write a haunted house book today and try to do the same thing, it's not going to work because the press won't pick up on it with as much fervor as they did the first time. But that, for the next book, you need to come up with something different. So come up with something different, something unique that nobody else is doing, put it out there and people will talk about it.
Yeah, you got to think outside the box in a proactive way.
That's what it's always been. I mean, if you took a marketing class 50 years ago, think outside the box is probably the first things they probably put up on the chalkboard.
That's right. All right. So we're getting close to ending the episode because I know you have a hard out. And I always ask every author the same exact question on the show, unless, of course, they come back for a second visit, which I hope you do. With that said, I'm going to put it on the screen. I'll read it to you. And boom. What is one piece of advice you discovered about writing that completely changed the way you approach the writing process?
Wow. So we had talked about James Patterson a little bit. So the first time he and I met, we had lunch down in Palm Beach and we started brainstorming ideas for a book. But we kind of ran into a brick wall because I was a pantser, which I'm sure your audience knows the term. I created my characters, my plot, kind of dropped them all in there and started writing. I had no idea where the story was going. He is from the opposite camp. He would create a 30 to 50 page outline for every book before he actually started writing. So we didn't think we'd be able to work together because the styles are just so different. And, we walked away from that lunch thinking that. And a couple months later, we touched base again. He said, "You know what? Let's try it your way. Let's pants a novel." So I'm the only guy who's ever gotten James Patterson to write a book without an outline.
Would you say you pantsed James Patterson?
Pretty much. So I would write some, scene and, create this crazy scenario, put him into something I don't think he'll ever get out of and send it off to him. And then 15 minutes later, he'd send me a new scene. And not only did he get out of that, but he put me into an even worse situation. And we went back and forth like that through the whole book. And it's the twistiest thing I've ever written. But a lot of words ended up on the cutting room floor in the editing process at the end, which happens when you pants a novel. So we finished it up and he called me and he said, "All right, we tried it your way. Now let's try it mine. Here's an outline." And he gave me an outline for a book called The Noise. And honestly, like we wrote that, it was so seamless, went so fast, very few, wasted words. We knew exactly where we were going with the story. So all the brain power that I used to put into trying to figure out, what comes next, like I had the outline in front of me. So I used that same brain power to figure out how do I make what comes next better. And we ended up with a more solid book that we wrote faster. So I think every author needs to try all the different ways to write a book, find the one that works for you. But in this particular case, I started off as a pantser thinking I would never, ever change my ways, tried to convince Patterson to become a pantser. And ultimately he flipped the dial and turned me into an outliner.
Yeah, but I do love how he wasn't a no person, and that's important to teams.
Yeah, like the guy is 78 years old and he is still trying new stuff every single day. And I think every author needs to have that mindset. He just started a Substack account. He's looking at like I don't even have a Substack account yet, but like he sees it as being one of the next big things. And I think we all need to think like that. What is coming next, and how do I take advantage of it?
Yeah, and just for any authors listening out there, one of the big lessons that we could definitely learn from JD Barker and, of course, James Patterson in this situation is when you're going to collaborate, even with a publisher, an agent, or other people trying to help you with your book, it's not about saying, no, your idea is bad or wrong for me. It's about, let's see where it goes, because you never know. You can work through it just like JD did with James, and you find yourselves discovering something completely new about yourself. And with that, JD Barker, I really appreciate your words of wisdom today, your insight, and let us dive a little deeper into the world of writing. And for the audience out there, how do they find you?
Easiest place to find me is at jdbarker.com. I'm on all the social medias at JD Barker, and the books are in pretty much every bookstore.
Fantastic. And again, JD, thank you so much for coming on and giving me some of your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Excellent. And hopefully we'll get you back soon, maybe for the next book.
Absolutely.
All right, so everyone out there, I'm Thomas J. Bellezza, and as always, keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Bye.